the gold of the Anunnaki gods and the secrets of immortality. Immortality may not only be feasible, it may very well have been achieved in the distant past. Ancient aliens may well have uncovered the secrets behind slowing our origins as a slave species, and the Anunnaki legacy in our DNA reveals compelling new archaeological and genetic evidence for the engineered origins of the human species, first proposed in the 12th planet. Shows how the Anunnaki created us using pieces of their own DNA, controlling our physical and mental capabilities by inactivating their more advanced DNA. Identifies a recently discovered complex of sophisticated ruins in South Africa as the city of the Anunnaki leader Enki. Scholars have long believed that the first civilization on Earth emerged in Sumer some 6,000 years ago. However, as Michael Tellinger reveals, the Sumerians and Egyptians inherited their knowledge from an earlier civilization that lived at the southern tip of Africa and began with the arrival of the Anunnaki more than 200,000 years ago. Sent to Earth in search of life-saving gold, these ancient Anunnaki astronauts from the planet Nibiru created the first humans as a slave race to mine gold, thus beginning our global traditions of gold obsession, slavery, and God as dominating master. Revealing new archaeological and genetic evidence in support of Zecharia Sitchin's revolutionary work with pre-biblical clay tablets. Tellinger shows how the Anunnaki created us using pieces of their own DNA, controlling our physical and mental capabilities by inactivating their more advanced DNA, which explains why less than 3% of our DNA is active. He identifies a recently discovered complex of sophisticated ruins in South Africa, complete with thousands of mines, as the city of Anunnaki leader Enki, and explains their lost technologies that used the power of sound as a source of energy. Matching key mythologies of the world's religions to the Sumerian clay tablets stories on which they are based, he details the actual events behind these tales of direct physical interactions with God. Concluding with the epic flood, a perennial theme of ancient myth that wiped out the Anunnaki mining operations. Tellinger shows that, as humanity awakens to the truth about our origins, we can overcome our programmed animalistic and slave-like nature, tap into our dormant Anunnaki DNA, and realize the longevity and intelligence of our creators, as well as learn the difference between the gods of myth and the true loving God of our universe. The Bible explains that the bloodline story began with Adam and Eve, from whose third son, Seth, evolved a line which progressed through Methuselah and Noah, and eventually to Abraham, who became the great patriarch of the Hebrew nation. It then relates that Abraham brought his family westwards out of Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, to the land of Canaan, or Palestine, from where some of his descendants moved into Egypt. After a few generations they moved back into Canaan, where, in time, the eventual David of Bethlehem became king of the newly defined kingdom of Israel. If viewed as it is presented in the scriptures, this is a fascinating saga, but there is nothing anywhere to indicate why the ancestral line of David and his heirs was in any way special. In fact, quite the reverse is the case. His ancestors are portrayed as a succession of wandering territory seekers who are seen to be of no particular significance until the time of King David. Their biblical history bears no comparison to, say, the contemporary pharaohs of ancient Egypt.
Their significance, we are told, comes from the fact that, from the time of Abraham, they were designated as God's chosen people. But even this leaves us wondering, because, according to the scriptures, their God led them through nothing but a succession of famines, wars and general hardship, and, on the face of it, these early Hebrews do not appear to have been too bright. We are faced, therefore, with a couple of possibilities. Either David was not of this Abraham succession at all, and was simply grafted into the list by later writers. Or maybe we have been presented with a very corrupted version of the family's early history, a version that was specifically designed to uphold the emergent Jewish faith, rather than to represent historical fact. In consideration of this, I was reminded of precisely what I had found with the New Testament. The Gospel texts that have been in the public domain for centuries bear little relation to the first-hand accounts of the era. The New Testament, as we know it, was compiled by the 4th century bishops to support the newly contrived Christian belief. But, what if the Jewish scribes had previously done exactly the same thing? Clearly, I had to get back to the more ancient writings in order to find any anomalies. The problem was that, even if this were possible, the earliest Hebrew writings, which were rehashed many centuries later, were themselves only written between the 6th and the 1st centuries BC, so they were not likely to be that authentic in their telling of history from thousands of years before. Indeed, it was plain that this would be the case, because when these books were first written their express purpose was to convey a history which upheld the principles of the Jewish faith, a faith that did not emerge until well into the ancestral story. Given that the first group of these books was written while the Jews were held captive in Mesopotamian Babylon in the 6th century BC, it is apparent that Babylon was where the original records were then held. In fact, from the time of Adam, through some 19 said generations down to Abraham, the whole of Old Testament patriarchal history was Mesopotamian. More specifically, the history was from Sumer in southern Mesopotamia, where the ancient Sumerians did indeed refer to the grasslands of the Euphrates Delta as the Eden. When researching for Bloodline of the Holy Grail, I found that good sources for some background information were the various Gospels and texts that were not selected for inclusion in the canonical New Testament. Perhaps, I thought, the same might apply to the Old Testament. The books of Enoch and Jubilees, for example, were among those not included. A further book, to which attention is specifically drawn in the Old Testament books of Joshua and Samuel, is the Book of Jasher. But despite its apparent importance to the Hebrew writers, it was not included in the final selection. 2 other works are also cited in the Bible. The Book of Numbers draws our attention to the Book of the Wars of Jehovah. And in the Book of Isaiah we are directed towards the Book of the Lord. What are these books? Where are these books? They are all mentioned in the Bible, which means they all predate the Old Testament, and they are all cited as being important. So, why did the editors see fit to exclude them when the selection was made? In pursuing an answer to this question and in studying the substance of the Old Testament prior to its corruption, one fact which becomes increasingly clear is that in English-language Bibles the definition Lord is used in a general context, but in earlier texts a positive distinction is drawn between Jehovah and the Lord. It has often been wondered why the biblical God of the Hebrews led them through trials and tribulations, floods and disasters, when, from time to time, he appears to have performed with a quite contrary and merciful personality. The answer is that, although now seemingly embraced as the one God by the Jewish and Christian churches, there was originally a distinct difference between the figures of Jehovah and the Lord. They were, in fact, quite separate deities. The God referred to as Jehovah was traditionally a storm god, a god of wrath and vengeance, whereas the God referred to as the Lord was a god of fertility and wisdom. So, what was the name given to the Lord in the early writings? It was, quite simply, the prevailing Hebrew word for Lord, and the word was Adon. As for the apparent personal name of Jehovah, this was not used in the early days, and even the Bible tells that the God of Abraham was called El Shaddai, which means lofty mountain.
The apparent name Jehovah came from the original Hebrew stem YHWH, which meant I am that I am, said to be a statement made by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, hundreds of years after the time of Abraham. Jehovah was therefore not a name at all, and early texts refer simply to El Shaddai and to his opposing counterpart, Adon. To the Canaanites, these gods were respectively called El Elyon and Baal, which meant precisely the same things, lofty mountain and Lord. In our modern Bibles, the definitions God and Lord are used and intermixed throughout, as if they were one and the same character, but originally they were not. One was a vengeful God, a people hater, and the other was a social God, a people supporter, and they each had wives, sons and daughters. The old writings tell us that throughout the patriarchal era the Israelites endeavored to support Adon, the Lord, but at every turn El Shaddai, the storm god, Jehovah, retaliated with floods, tempests, famines and destruction. Even at the very last, around 600 BC, the Bible explains that Jerusalem was overthrown at Jehovah's bidding and tens of thousands of Jews were taken into Babylonian captivity simply because their king, a descendant of King David, had erected altars in veneration of Baal, the Adon. It was during the course of this captivity that the Israelites weakened and finally conceded. They decided to succumb to the God of wrath, and developed a new religion out of sheer fear of his retribution. It was at this time that the name of Jehovah first appeared, and this was only 500 years before the time of Jesus. Subsequently, the Christian Church took Jehovah on board as well, calling him simply God, and all the hitherto social concepts of the Adon were totally discarded. The two religions were henceforth both faiths of fear. Even today, their followers are classified as God-fearing. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us knowing that within an overall pantheon of gods and goddesses, many of whom are actually named in the Bible, there were two predominant and opposing gods. In different cultures they have been known as El Elyon and Baal, El Shaddai and Adon, Ahriman and Mazda, Jehovah and Lord, God and Father. But these styles are all titular, they are not personal names. So who precisely were they? To find the answer we have to look no further than where these gods were actually operative, and the old Canaanite texts, discovered in Syria in the 1920s, tell us that their courts were in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in Mesopotamia, in the Sumerian Eden Delta of the Persian Gulf. But what did the ancient Sumerians call these two gods? What were their personal names? We can trace the Sumerian written records back to about 3700 BC. And they tell us that the gods in question were brothers. In Sumer, the storm god who eventually became known as Jehovah was called Enlil-Ur-Lu-Kurgal, meaning ruler of the mountain, and his brother, who became Adon, the Lord, was called Enki. This name is really important to our story because Enki means archetype. The texts inform us that it was Enlil who brought the flood. It was Enlil who destroyed Ur and Babylon. It was Enlil who constantly opposed the education and enlightenment of humankind. Indeed, the early Syrian texts tell us that it was Enlil who obliterated the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah on the Dead Sea, not because they were dens of wickedness, as we are taught, but because they were great centers of wisdom and learning. It was Enki, on the other hand, who, despite the wrath of his brother, granted the Sumerians access to the Tree of Knowledge and the Tree of Life. It was Enki who set up the escape strategy during the flood, and it was Enki who passed over the time-honored tables of destiny, the tables of scientific law which became the bedrock of the early mystery schools in Egypt. Many books talk about the Hermetic school of Thutmose III of Egypt, who reigned about 1450 BC. But it is not generally known that the school he originally inherited was the royal court of the dragon. This had been founded by the priests of Mendes in about 2200 BC and was subsequently ratified by the 12th dynasty Queen Sobekneferu. This sovereign and priestly order passed from Egypt to the kings of Jerusalem, to the Black Sea princes of Scythia and into the Balkans, notably to the royal house of Hungary, whose king Sigismund reconstituted the court just 600 years ago. Today it exists as the imperial and royal court of the dragon sovereignty, and after some 4,000 years it is the oldest sovereign court in the world. But what were the earliest aims and ambitions of the order back in pharaonic times? They were to perpetuate and advance the alchemical strength of the royal bloodline from Lord Enki, the archetype. The kings of the early succession, who reigned in Sumer and Egypt before becoming kings of Israel, were anointed upon coronation with the fat of the dragon, the sacred crocodile. This noble beast was referred to in Egypt as the Mess, from which derived the Hebrew verb to anoint, and the kings of this dynastic succession were always referred to as dragons, or messiahs, meaning anointed ones. In times of battle, when the armies of different kingdoms were conjoined, an overall leader was chosen and he was called the Grey Dragon, the King of Kings, or, as we better know the name in its old Celtic form, the Pendragon. One of the interesting items from the archives of the Dragon Court is the origin of the word kingship. It derives from the very earliest of Sumerian culture, wherein kingship was identical with kinship, and kin means blood relative. In its original form, kinship was kinship. And the first king of the Messianic dragon succession was the biblical Cain, head of the Sumerian house of Kish. On recognizing this, one can immediately see the first anomaly in the traditional Genesis story, for the historical line to David and Jesus was not from Adam and Eve's son Seth at all. It was from Eve's son Cain, whose recorded successors, although given little space in the Old Testament, were the first great kings, or Cains, of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Two more important features then come to light when reading the Bible again with this knowledge in mind.
We all tend to think of Cain as being the first son of Adam and Eve, but he was not. Even the book of Genesis tells us that he was not, and it confirms how Eve told Adam that Cain's father was the Lord. Who was the Lord? The Lord was Adon, and Adon was Enki. Even outside the Bible, the writings of the Hebrew Talmud and Midrash make it quite plain that Cain was not the son of Adam. So what else have we been wrongly taught about this particular aspect of history? The book of Genesis, in its English translated form, tells us that Cain was a tiller of the ground. But this is not what the original texts say at all. What they say is that Cain had dominion over the earth, which is a rather different matter when considering his kingly status. In fact, the Bible translators appear to have had a constant problem with the word earth, often translating it to ground, clay or dust. But the early texts actually referred to the earth. Even in the case of Adam and Eve, the translators got it wrong. The Bible says, male and female he created them, and he called their name Adam. The older writings use the more complete word Adama, which means of the earth. But this did not mean they were made of dirt, it means that they were of the earth, or, as the Anchor Hebrew Bible explains in absolutely precise terms, they were earthlings. There is a lot to be said about the story of Adam and Eve and of how they were the result of clinical cloning. Writers such as Zechariah Sitchin have written at some length in this regard, and my new book delves far more deeply into the subject. I shall not dwell upon this particular aspect now because I want to move more directly into the alchemy of the messianic bloodline of the earthly dragon kings. What I will say is that the Sumerian records state that around 6,000 years ago, Adam and Eve, known then as Ataba and Ava, and jointly as the Adama, were purpose-bred for kingship at the house of Shimti by Enki and his sister wife Ninkursag. In Sumerian, the word Shimti meant breath, wind, life. Adam was certainly not the first man on earth, but he was the first of the alchemically devised kingly succession. Ninkursag was called Lady of the Embryo or Lady of Life, and she was the surrogate mother for Ataba and Ava, who were created from human ova fertilized by the Lord Enki. It was because of Ninkursag's title, Lady of Life, that Ava was later given the same title by the Hebrews. Indeed, the name Ava, or Eve, was subsequently said to mean life. And there is an interesting parallel here, because in Sumerian the distinction Lady of Life was Ninti, Nin meaning lady, and Ti meaning life. However, another Sumerian word, Ti, with the longer pronunciation, Ti, meant rib, and it was by virtue of the Hebrews' misunderstanding of the two words, D and T, that Eve also became incorrectly associated with Adam's rib. Both Enki and Ninkursag, along with their brother Enlil, the later Jehovah, belong to a pantheon of gods and goddesses referred to as the Anunnaki, meaning heaven came to earth. In fact, the Grand Assembly of the Anunnaki, later called the Court of the Elohim, is mentioned in Psalm 82, wherein Jehovah makes his bid for supreme power over the other gods. According to the dragon tradition, the importance of Cain was that he was directly produced by Enki and Ava, so his blood was 3/4 Anunnaki. His half-brothers Hevel and Satanael, better known as Abel and Seth, were less than half Anunnaki, being the offspring of Ataba and Ava, Adam and Eve. Cain's Anunnaki blood was so advanced that it was said that his brother Abel's blood was earthbound by comparison. Cain, It was said in the scriptures, rose far above Abel, so that his brother's blood was swallowed into the ground. But this original description was thoroughly mistranslated for our modern Bible, and we are now told that Cain rose up against Abel and spilled his blood upon the ground. This is not the same thing at all. We can now progress our story by considering the oldest grant of arms in sovereign history, a grant of arms which denoted the messianic dragon bloodline for all time.
The Sumerians referred to this insignia as the grau. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? From biblical history, however, we know it better as the mark of Cain. This mark is portrayed to us by the Church as if it were some form of curse. But, knowing what we now know, the Bible does not actually say this. What it says is that, having got into an argument with Jehovah over a matter of sovereign observance, Cain feared for his life. We are then informed that the Lord placed a mark upon Cain, swearing sevenfold vengeance against his enemies. No one has ever really understood why Jehovah should decide to protect Cain when it was he who held the grievance against him. But the fact is that Jehovah did not make this decision. Cain's protector was not Jehovah. As stated, the mark was settled upon Cain by the Lord, and the Lord, the Adon, was Cain's own father, Enki. Few people ever think to inquire about the supposed enemies of Cain as defined in Genesis. Who could they possibly have been? Where would they have come from? According to the Bible, only Adam and Eve, with their sons Cain and Abel, existed, and Cain had apparently killed Abel. If we are to accept the text as it stands, there was no one around to be his enemy. So, what was this Sumerian grau which the Bible calls the mark of Cain? It was an emblem dignified as the cup of the waters or the rosy crucis, the dew cup, and it was identified in all records, including those of Egypt and Phoenicia and in the Hebrew annals, as being an upright, centered red cross within the circle. Throughout the ages it was developed and embellished, but it has always remained essentially the same and is recognized as being the original symbol of the Holy Grail. Another anomaly is presented soon afterwards in Genesis when we are told that Cain found himself a wife. To unearth were her parents if Adam and Eve were the only couple alive. Without confronting this anomaly at all, Genesis then proceeds to list for us the names of Cain's descendants. It becomes clear from all of this that some very important information has been edited from the Old Testament narrative. Clearly there were plenty of other people around at the time and it is not difficult to find their stories outside the Bible. Quite apart from the Sumerian annals, even Old Hebrew and early Christian texts give us far more information in this regard. In order to further enhance the succession from Cain, he was married to his half-sister, a purebred Anunnaki princess, Luluwa. Her father was Enki and her mother was Lilith, a granddaughter of Enlil. Although not giving the name of Cain's wife, the Bible does name their younger son Enoch, while the Sumerian records cite his elder son and kingly successor, Adam, who is perhaps better known as King Etenna of Kish. Etenna was said to have walked with the gods, and to have been fed from the plant of birth, or the tree of life, as it is called in Genesis. Henceforth, the kings of the line were designated as being the twigs of the tree, and the ancient word for twig was clone. In later times this plant or tree was redefined as a vine, and so the grau, the vine and the messianic bloodline became conjoined as one in the literature of subsequent ages. By virtue of their contrived breeding, this kingly succession was modeled specifically for leadership, and in all aspects of knowledge, culture, awareness, wisdom and intuition they were highly advanced against their mundane contemporaries. In order to keep their blood as pure as possible, they always married within a close kinship. It was fully recognized that the prominent gene of the succession was carried within the blood of the mother. Today we call this the mitochondrial D.N.A'. And so was born a tradition inherited by their kingly descendants in Egypt and by the later Celtic rulers of Europe. True kingship, it was maintained, was transferred through the female, and so kingly marriages were strategically cemented with maternal half-sisters or first cousins. Having reached the point where the plant of birth is first mentioned in the records, we are at about 3500 BC, and it is at this point that we begin to learn how the kingly succession was orally fed with bodily supplements from the early days. This practice continued for more than 1,000 years until the nourishment program became wholly scientific and alchemical. Before getting into the detail of the kingly diet, it is worth considering why it was that the all-important royal bloodline which progressed from Cain and his sons was strategically ignored by the Hebrews and the Christian Church in favor of their promoting a parallel junior line from Adam's son Seth. Why was it that the immediate Cainite dynasty was eventually shunned by the fearful disciples of Enlil Jehovah? In the Old Testament book of Genesis, the lines of descent are given from Cain and from his half-brother Seth, but it is of interest to note that through the early generations the names detailed in each list are pretty much the same, although given in a different order: Enoch, Yared, Mahalaleel, Methuselah, and Lamech. In view of this, it has often been suggested that the line from the Seth down to Lamech's son Noah was, not very cleverly, contrived by the Bible compilers so as to avoid showing the true descent from Cain to the time of Noah. If this were the case, then something must have occurred during the lifetime of Noah to cause the ancestral story to be veiled by the later writers. The answer is to be found in the Bible itself. At that stage in the family's history, the vengeful Jehovah apparently warned Noah and his sons against the ingestion of blood, an edict which became expressly important to the later Jewish way of life. It has long been a customary Jewish practice to hang meat for bloodletting before cooking and consumption. But, in contrast, the Christian faith is especially concerned with the figurative ingestion of blood. In the Christian tradition it is customary to take the communion sacrament, the Mass, wherein wine is drunk from the sacred chalice, symbolically representing the blood of Jesus, the lifeblood of the Messianic vine. Could it be, perhaps, that the modern Christian custom is an unwitting throwback to some distant pre-Noah ritual which Jehovah opposed? If so, then since it is known that the chalice is a holy female symbol which has been emblematic of the womb from the earliest times, might this even have been an extract of menstrual blood? The answer to these questions is yes. That was precisely the custom, but it was not so unsavory as it might seem.
Indeed, few of us think to inquire about the ultimate sources of many of today's ingested medicines and bodily supplements, and those in the know would often be reluctant to tell us. The Premarin hormone, for example, comes from the urine of pregnant mares, while certain growth hormones and insulin are manufactured from E. coli, a fecal bacterium. The blood extract in question was, in the first instance, not human but from the sacred Anunnaki lunar essence, that of Enki's sister Ninkersag, the designated Lady of Life. It was defined as the most potent of all life forces and was venerated as being starfire. It was from the womb of Ninkersag that the kingly line was born, and it was with her blood, the divine starfire, that the dragon succession was supplementally fed. In ancient Egypt, Ninkersag was called Isis, and by either name she was the ultimate mother of the messianic line, for hers was the matriarchal gene which constituted the beginning, the gene Isis, or, as the Greeks identified it, the Genesis. It is worth reminding ourselves, then, that the biblical edict to abstain from blood came not from Enki the wise but from Enlil Jehovah. The god of wrath who had instigated the flood, had wrought havoc in Ur and Babylon, and had endeavored to deceive Adam by saying that he would die if he ate from the tree of knowledge. This was not a god who liked people, and the Sumerian records are very clear in this regard. Hence, if he forbade the taking of blood, this was not likely to have been an edict for the benefit of Noah and his descendants, it was most probably to their detriment. In strict terms the original starfire was the lunar essence of the goddess, but, even in an everyday mundane environment, menstruum contains the most valuable endocrinal secretions, especially those of the pineal and pituitary glands. The brain's pineal gland in particular was directly associated with the tree of life, for this tiny gland was said to secrete the very essence of active longevity, called soma, or, as the Greeks called it, ambrosia. In mystic circles, the menstrual flower, she who flows, has long been the designated flower and is represented as a lily or a lotus. Indeed, the definition flower is the very root of our modern word flower. In ancient Sumer, the key females of the dragon succession were all venerated as lilies, having such names as Lily, Luluwa, Lilith, Lilatu, and Lilith. In pictorial representation, the messianic dragon bore little relation to the winged, fire-breathing beast of later Western mythology. It was, in essence, a large-jawed serpent with 4 legs, very much like a crocodile or monitor. This was the sacred mess whose name was Draco. Draco was a divine emblem of the Egyptian pharaohs, a symbol of the Egyptian Therapetate, of the Essenes Aquarian, and was the Besta and Neptunus, the sea serpent, of the descendant Merovingian fisher kings in Europe. In the Old Hebrew Bibles, all references to serpents are made by use of the word Nahash, from the stem NHSH, but this usage does not relate to serpents in the way that we would know them, that is, as venomous snakes. It relates to serpents in their traditional capacity as bringers of wisdom and enlightenment, for the word Nahash actually means to decipher or to find out. Serpents, in one form or another, were always associated with wisdom and healing, and the trees of life and knowledge are customarily identified with serpents. Indeed, the insignia of many of today's medical associations is precisely this image of a serpent coiled around the plant of birth, tree of life, a depiction shown in the clay reliefs of ancient Sumer to be Enki's personal emblem. Interestingly, though, another common emblem for medical relief organizations depicts 2 coiled serpents, spiraling around the winged caduceus of Hermes the magician. In these instances the true symbolism of the starfire ritual is conveyed, and this symbol can be traced back to the very origins of the alchemical mystery schools and Gnostic institutions. Most of you are probably quite familiar with the functions of the pineal and other glands of the endocrinal system. But for those who are perhaps not, the pineal is a very small gland, shaped like a pine cone and about the size of a grain of corn. It is centrally situated within the brain, although outside the ventricles and not forming a part of the brain matter as such. The pineal gland was thought by the 17th century French optical scientist René Descartes to be the seat of the soul,
the point at which the mind and body are conjoined. The ancient Greeks considered it likewise, and in the 4th century BC Herophilus described the pineal as an organ which regulated the flow of thought. This gland has long intrigued anatomists because, while the rest of the brain is double, the pineal has no counterpart. In the days of ancient Sumer, the priests of Anu, the father of Enlil and Enki, perfected and elaborated a ramifying medical science of living substances, with menstrual starfire being an essential source component. In the first instance, this was pure Anunnaki luminescence called gold of the gods, and it was fed only to the kings and queens of the dragon succession. Later, however, in Egypt and Mediterranean, menstrual starfire was ritually collected from sacred virgin priestesses who were venerated as scarlet women. Indeed, the very word ritual stems from this practice, and from the word ritu, which defined the sacred ceremony of the red gold. Endocrinal supplements are, of course, still used by today's organotherapy establishment, but their inherent secretions, such as melatonin and serotonin, are obtained from the desiccated glands of dead animals, and they lack the truly important elements which exist only in live human glandular manufacture. In the fire symbolism of ancient alchemy, the color red is synonymous with the metal gold. In some traditions, including the Indian tantras, red is also identifiable with black. Hence, the goddess Kali is said to be both red and black. The original heritage of Kali was, however, Sumerian, and she was said to be Kulamath, the sister of Cain's wife Luluwa. Kali was a primary princess of the dragon house, and from her starfire association she became the goddess of time, seasons, periods and cycles. Because of this, her name was the root of the word calendar, which is concerned with the divisions of seasonal time. In the early days, therefore, the metals of the alchemists were not common metals but living essences, and the ancient mysteries were of a physical, not a metaphysical, nature. Indeed, the very word secret has its origin in the hidden knowledge of glandular secretions. Truth was the ritu, the redness or blackness, and from the word ritu stems not only ritual but also the words rite, root and red. The ritu, it was said, reveals itself as physical matter in the form of the purest and most noble of all metals, gold. Hence, gold was deemed an ultimate truth. Just as the word secret has its origin in the translation of an ancient word, so too do other related words have their similar basis. In ancient Egypt, the word amen was used to signify something hidden or concealed. The word occult meant pretty much the same, hidden from view, and yet today we use amen to conclude hymns, while something occult is deemed sinister. In real terms, however, they both relate to the word secret, and all three words were, at one time or another, connected with the mystic science of endocrinal secretions. Since Kali was associated with black, being black but beautiful, the English word kohl, denoting that which is black, stems also from her name via the intermediate word kohl. In the Hebrew tradition, Bath Kohl, a Kali counterpart, was called the daughter of the voice, and the voice was said to originate during a female's puberty. Hence, the womb was associated with the voice, and starfire was said to be the oracular word of the womb. The womb was, therefore, itself the utterer, or the uterus. The Scarlet Women were so called because of their being a direct source of the priestly starfire. They were known in Greek as the Hierogyli, sacred women, a word later transformed, via medieval French into English, to harlot. In the early Germanic tongue, they were known as whores, which was later anglicized to whores. However, the word originally meant, quite simply, beloved ones. As pointed out in good etymological dictionaries, these words were descriptions of high veneration and were never interchangeable with such words as prostitute or adulteress. Their now common association was, in fact, a wholly contrived strategy of the medieval Roman Church in its bid to denigrate the noble status of the sacred priestess. The withdrawal of knowledge of the genuine starfire tradition from the public domain occurred when the science of the early adepts and later Gnostics, the true pre-Christian Christians, was stifled by the forgers of historic Christianity. A certain amount of the original gnosis, or knowledge, is preserved in Talmudic and rabbinical lore, but, generally speaking, the mainstream Jews and Christians did all in their power to distort and destroy all traces of the ancient art. In addition to being the gold of the gods, the Anunnaki menstruum was also called the vehicle of light, being the ultimate source of manifestation, and in this regard it was directly equated with the mystical waters of creation, the flow of eternal wisdom. It was for this reason that the rosy crucis, the dew cup, or cup of the waters identified as a red cross within a circle, became the mark of Cain, in the subsequent emblem of the kingly succession. It was said that the light remained quite dormant in a spiritually unawakened person, but that it could be awakened and motivated by the spiritual energy of self-will, and by constant self-inquiry. This is not an obvious mental process, but a truly thought-free consciousness, a formless plane of pure being. It was this very concept of being or self-completeness which posed the ultimate problem for Enlil-Jehovah. In contrast, his brother Enki knew that humans who partook of the tree of knowledge, the Anunnaki wisdom, and of the plant of birth, the Anunnaki starfire, could themselves become almost like gods. Even Jehovah was said to have recognized this, and Genesis states that when Adam had taken the fruit of the tree, Jehovah said, "Behold, the man is become as one of us." Enki the wise, guardian of the tree of knowledge, also had another name in the Hebrew tradition. They called him Samael, because he was the designated lord of Sama in northern Mesopotamia. The teachings of the early mystery schools were very specific about the trees of life and knowledge, and they emulated the very teachings of Enki himself. It was said, nothing is obtained simply by wanting. And nothing is achieved by relinquishing responsibility to a higher authority. Belief is the act of believing, for to believe is to believe, and will is the ultimate medium of the self.
The Sumerian records relate that Cain's son, King Epaena, partook of the plant of birth in order to father his own son and heir, King Baali, and the plant of birth was directly associated with individual longevity and the office of kinship, or kingship. It was itself related to starfire and to pineal gland activity, and partaking of the plant of birth was the ritual of ingesting the starfire. the pure Anunnaki female essence, the nectar of supreme excellence. In this regard, the Anunnaki flower or lily, was held to be the cupbearer, the transmitter of the rich food of the matrix. In this capacity, she was called the Rose of Sharon, from the word Shah, meaning orbit, along with the words Ran-on, relating to the ultimate temple of light. The significance of this highly venerated station is actually made apparent in the Bible's esoteric Song of Solomon, wherein the Messianic bride proclaims to the king, "I am the Rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys." A Starfire recipient king was considered to have become qualified for kingship when he reached a predestined state of enlightened consciousness, a state when his aptitudes for wisdom and leadership had been enhanced to a realm of kingship called the Malku. It was from this Mesopotamian word Malku that the Hebrews derived their words Malchus, king, and Malkut, kingdom. Only in very recent times have medical scientists identified the hormonal secretion of the pineal gland, finally isolating it in 1968. The essence was called melatonin, which means night worker, from the Greek, melos, meaning black, and tosos, meaning labor. Those with the high melatonin output react strongly against sunlight because it affects their mental capability. They are essentially night operatives. Melatonin is called the hormone of darkness as it is produced only at night or in the dark. Exposure to an excess of sunlight actually makes the pineal gland smaller and lessens spiritual awareness, whereas darkness and high pineal activity enhance the keen intuitive knowledge of the subtle mind while reducing the stress factor. At this stage, it is of interest to note how it was that the Christian Church eventually demolished the true significance of the Starfire ritual by maneuvering it into the realm of sinister Gothic legend. In the old tradition, the ultimate holders of the Malkut were known as dragons or pendragons, and the reigning head was always known as Draco. By virtue of their bodily conditioning through supplementary melatonin and other hormonal secretions, they were in fact princes of darkness. And they gained their heightened awareness, above normal powers and longevity from the Starfire, the lunar blood of the Anunnaki queens and the priestly Scarlet Women. As detailed in Bloodline of the Holy Grail, the brutal Catholic inquisitions of the Middle Ages were set against all the so-called heretics who in one way or another supported the messianic blood royal, the sangreal, of the Dragon Kings against the corrupted dogma of the bishops. Many of the victims were classified as occultists and witches, and they were charged with upholding the ancient and heretical cult of Draco, the Prince of Darkness. They were proclaimed by the church authorities to be vampires. I previously mentioned the significance of the ancient Egyptian court of the dragon, pointing out that after some 4,000 years this sovereign order is still operative today. Back in the 15th century, a prominent chancellor of the court was Prince Vlad III of Transylvania-Wallachia, who built the citadel of Bucharest. Vlad is perhaps better remembered, however, as Count Dracula, meaning son of Dracul, a name by which his father was known within the court from 1431. Vlad was a prince of harsh disciplines, and his method of execution for crimes against the state was impalement upon wooden stakes. This was quite compatible with other hideous punishments of the time, boiling in oil, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering, etc. But Vlad's particular method became reversed against him in a later Gothic novel tradition which claimed that Dracula should be killed by impalement with a wooden stake. The establishment's real fear of Dracula, however, was not his savage treatment of enemies. Such things were commonplace in their day, but his in-depth knowledge of alchemy and the ancient Starfire customs. Having attended the Austrian School of Solomon in Hermannstadt, he had an in-depth scientific understanding of the bodily effects of melatonin and serotonin which enhance longevity and increase consciousness.
Clearly, as the Romanian annals determine, he was a high melatonin producer, and, as we have seen, such people are adversely affected by sunlight. They are night workers, melostozos. Consequently, the Transylvanian myth was born, and in Bram Stoker's novel, published in 1897, with its centenary last year, Vlad Dracula was portrayed as a vampire, a prince of darkness who imbibed the blood of virgins. Notwithstanding this, a good deal of truly early folklore was actually based upon the Grail and dragon traditions. The very concept of fairies, fair folk, was born directly from this base, being a derivative of fee or fae and relating especially to fate. In the Celtic world, certain royal families were said to carry the fairy blood, that is to say, the fate or destiny of the Grail bloodline, while the Grail princesses of romance and history were often called elf maidens. They were the designated guardians of the earth, starlight and forest, as beguilingly replicated by the elven race in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. In the old language of southern Europe, a female elf was an Ebi, and from this word derived the town name of Albi, the Languedoc center of the Gnostic Cathars, the Pure Ones, in the Middle Ages. When Pope Innocent III launched his brutal 35-year military assault upon the Cathars from 1208, his campaign was called the Albigensian Crusade because it was set against the supporters of the Albigens, elven blood. Melatonin enhances and boosts the body's immune system, and those with high pineal secretion are less likely to develop cancerous diseases. High melatonin production heightens energy, stamina and physical tolerance levels, and it is directly related to sleep patterns, keeping the body temperately regulated with properties that operate through the cardiovascular system. It is, in fact, the body's most potent and effective antioxidant, and it has positive mental and physical anti-aging properties. It is manufactured by the pineal gland through the activation of a chemical messenger called serotonin. This transmits nerve impulses across chromosome pairs at a point when the cell nuclei are divided and the chromosomes are halved, a process called meiosis, eventually to be combined with other half sets upon fertilization. Pine resin was long identified with pineal secretion and was used to make frankincense, the incense of priesthood. Gold, on the other hand, was a traditional symbol of kingship. Hence, gold and frankincense were the traditional substances of the priest-kings of the Messianic bloodline, along with myrrh, a gum resin used as a medical sedative, which was symbolic of death. In the ancient world, higher knowledge was identified as death, from which comes our word, death. In fact, as we know very well, the New Testament describes that these three substances, gold, frankincense and myrrh, were presented to Jesus by the Magi, thereby identifying him beyond doubt as an hereditary priest-king of the dragon succession. Yoga teachers suggest that the pineal gland, which they call the third eye or eye of wisdom, is significant in the process of becoming aware, for it is the ultimate source of the light. Illuminists and other Rosicrucian adepts have long referred to the pineal as the secret ayin, an ancient word for eye. This spelling, ayin, is actually quite important because the original spelling of Cain, whether with a C, a K or a Q, was not Cain as we now know it, but Cayin. The name Cain, in its various forms, actually denoted one of the inner eye. Hence, from Cain with a K derived the word king, and from Cain with a Q derived the word queen. Indeed, Cain's father Enki Samael was himself the Sumerians' designated lord of the sacred eye. It is said that a truly spiritual person can automatically perceive with the third eye, the subtle eye of insight, rather than be duped by mundane eyes which reveal only physical presences. Such presences are defined by their place within arbitrary time, but to pineal graduates there is no time to calculate, for they live in a dimension where time and space are of no consequence. This dimension is not a new discovery of modern science. It was known about thousands of years ago as the plane of Charon, the plane of the orbit of light. And so the Canaanite kings of Mesopotamia, the first Pendragons of the Messianic bloodline, while already being of high Anunnaki substance, were fed with further Anunnaki star fire to increase their perception, awareness and intuition so that they became masters of knowingness, almost like gods themselves. At the same time their stamina levels and immune systems were dramatically strengthened so that the anti-aging properties of the regularly ingested Anunnaki melatonin and serotonin facilitated extraordinary lifespans. All records of the era confirm that this was the case, with those of the kingly line living for hundreds of years. And in this regard there is no reason to be over-skeptical about the great ages of the early patriarchs as given in the book of Genesis. In addition to the starfire ritual, the bloodline kings were also said to have been nourished with the milk of the goddess, and it would appear that this milk contained an enzyme that was itself conducive to active longevity. Today's genetic researchers call this enzyme telomerase. As recently reported in the journal Science, Volume 279, January 16, 1998, corporate studies and those of the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center have determined that telomerase has unique anti-aging properties. Healthy body cells are programmed to divide many times during a lifetime, but this process of division and replication is finite, so that a non-dividing state is ultimately achieved. This is a crucial factor of aging. The division potential is controlled by caps at the end of DNA strands, rather like the plastic tips on shoelaces. These caps are the telomeres. As each cell divides, a piece of telomere is lost, and the dividing process ceases when the telomeres have shortened to an optimum and critical length. There is then no new cell replication, and all that follows is deterioration. Laboratory experiments with tissue samples have now shown that application of the genetic enzyme telomerase can prevent telomere shortening upon cell division and replication. Hence, body cells can continue to divide way beyond their naturally restricted programming, just as do cancer cells, which can achieve immortality through being rich in telomerase. Telomerase is not usually expressed in normal body tissue, but apart from being present in malignant tumors, it is also apparent in reproductive cells.
It seems, therefore, that somewhere within our DNA structure is the genetic ability to produce this anti-aging enzyme, but that the potential has somehow been switched off and probably exists within those aspects of our DNA which scientists currently refer to as junk. In the canonical Bible we are told that, during the lifetimes of Noah and his sons, Jehovah issued the edict which forbade the ingesting of blood. At least this was the time frame applied to the edict by the Old Testament compilers in the 6th century BC. It is unlikely, however, that this was the correct time frame, for at that time Enlil Jehovah would have had no such final authority over Enki and the Grand Assembly of the Anunnaki. Nevertheless, it is apparent that, from that time, the given ages of the patriarchal strain begin to diminish quite considerably, so that from the days of Abraham and Isaac we are presented, in the main, with rather more normal lifespans. In contrast, though, the lifespans of the Sumerian kings in descent from Cain and Etana continued at a generally high level. What we do know beyond doubt is that whatever the realities of the edict and its chronology, a major change in the starfire practice became necessary in about 1960 BC. This was when the Bible tells us that Abraham and his family moved northward from Ur of the Chaldees, the capital of Sumer, to Haran before turning westward into Canaan. Contemporary historical texts record that at that time Ur was sacked by the king of nearby Elam soon after 2000 BC and, although the city was rebuilt, the power center moved north to Haran in the kingdom of Mari. But Haran was not just the name of a flourishing city, it was the name of Abraham's brother, the father of Lot. Existing documents, discovered in 1934, also revealed that other cities in Mesopotamia were similarly named in accordance with Abraham's forebears, cities such as Terah, Abraham's father, Nahor, Terah's father, Serug, Nahor's father, and Peleg, Serug's grandfather. Quite apparently, in line with all the Sumerian evidence which supports the kingly line from Cain, these lately discovered reports confirm that the immediate family of Abraham, in the succession after Noah, were also great commissioners of the region in general. Clearly, the patriarchs represented no ordinary family but constituted a very powerful dynasty. But why would such a long-standing heritage of prominence and renown come to an abrupt end and force Abraham out of Mesopotamia into Canaan? The answer is to be found in clay tablets which can be dated to about 1960 BC. They detail that, at that time, everything changed in the hitherto sacred land of Sumer when invaders came in from all sides. Akkadians from the north, Amorites from Syria, and Elamites from Persia. When they overthrew, when order they destroyed, then like a deluge all things together consumed. Whereunto, O Sumer? Did they change thee? The sacred dynasty from the temple they exiled. It was at this stage of Sumerian history that the empire fell and Abraham was forced to flee northward from the city of Ur. But what had happened to the Anunnaki, the grand assembly of gods who had established everything? The text continues. Ur is destroyed, bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like hot bronze in a mold. Bodies dissolve like fat in the sun. Our temple is destroyed. Smoke lies on our cities like a shroud. The gods have abandoned us like migrating birds. In historical terms, this total collapse of the Sumerian Empire follows the founding of Babylon by King Ur-Baba in about 2000 BC. Indeed, the story of the Tower of Babel and the resultant wrath of Jehovah precisely fits the time frame of the Sumerians' own abandonment by the Anunnaki. The story in Genesis relates that the people, who were hitherto said by Jehovah to be very good, were severely punished because of a strange transgression which had not previously been ruled upon. The apparent transgression was that they all spoke the same language, and the unique language which they all spoke was, of course, Sumerian, the first written language on earth. For a reason which is not made clear in the Bible, the Genesis text explains that Jehovah was not happy about the Tower of Babel and so he did come down, and did confound the language of all the earth. The Sumerian historical documents tell much the same story, except that the confounding of language is far better explained by the hordes of foreign invaders who came into the region. It transpires that this invasion was the direct result of friction among the Anunnaki. For at Anu's retirement from the Grand Assembly his eldest son Enlil Jehovah assumed the presidency. He proclaimed that he was master of all the earth, although his brother Enki Samael could retain sovereignty of the seas. Enki was not at all happy about his brother's claim because, although Enlil was the elder of the two, his mother, Ki, was their father Anu's junior sister, whereas Enki's mother, Antu, was the senior sister. True kingship, claimed Enki, progressed as a matrilinear institution through the female line, and by this right of descent Enki maintained that he was the firstborn of the royal succession. I am Enki, the great brother of the gods. I am he who has been born as the first son of the divine Anu. As a result, the people of Babylon announced their allegiance to Enki and his son Marduk, but this was all too much for Enlil Jehovah. Having lost his popularity, he opened the gates of Sumer to let in invaders from all sides. The scribes recorded that he, the vengeful Enlil Jehovah, brought about the great and terrible storm which caused the annihilation of all the Sumerian culture so that their language was no longer predominant and there was a great confusion of tongues. All the work which had been accomplished in building up a unique civilization over thousands of years was destroyed in one fell swoop by Enlil Jehovah, simply because he would not share authority with his brother Enki. The records confirm that, at that moment in Sumerian history, the Grand Assembly of the Anunnaki vacated their seats and departed like migrating birds. For all that had occurred up to that point, an urgent and significant change in kingly procedure was necessary because the Anunnaki starfire was no longer available. A substitute had to be found. As previously mentioned, the priestly scarlet women had been purpose-bred for this, but it was clear that, however carefully mated, their essence would weaken through the generations.
In the event, the creation of a more permanent and versatile substitute was not a problem, for this was the province of a group of previously trained metallurgists whom Enki had called the master craftsmen. The first of these great metallurgists to be trained was Tubal-Cain the Vulcan, a sixth-generation descendant of Cain, who is remembered even today in modern Freemasonry. In consideration of the Bible's New Testament symbology, it is of particular interest to note that Jesus' father Joseph was himself recorded in the early Gospels as being a master craftsman. In modern English language Bibles, Joseph is described as a carpenter, but this is a blatant mistranslation. The word carpenter was wrongly derived from the Greek holtekton, which actually defined a master of the craft, not a woodworker, but the learned alchemical metallurgist in the manner of his ancestral forebears. In the Old Testament book of Exodus, at the time of Moses we are introduced to a certain Bezaleel, the son of Uri Ben-Hur, who was said to have been filled with the spirit of the Elohim in wisdom, understanding and knowledge. We learn, furthermore, that Bezaleel was a skilled goldsmith and a master craftsman, and that he was placed in overall charge of building the Ark of the Covenant. In detailing how Bezaleel should manufacture various crowns, rings, bowls and a candlestick, all of pure gold, the Bible text adds to the list something called the showbread of the covenant, and without further explanation the deed is seen to be done. Although the word covenant has come to be identified with contractual agreements, it originally meant to eat bread with, and it is pertinent to note that the Lord's Prayer, which was directly transposed from an Egyptian equivalent, specifies "Give us this day our daily bread." This is often taken to relate to sustenance in general terms, but in the original tradition the reference was more specifically directed to the enigmatic showbread, the golden bread of Bezaleel. The book of Leviticus also refers to the showbread. "And thou shalt take fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. And thou shalt put pure frankincense upon each row." The use of the word flour in English translations is actually incorrect. The word powder would be more accurate. The records of the mystery schools cite rather more precisely that showbread was made with the white powder of gold. And this is particularly significant because in Exodus it is stated that Moses took the golden calf which the Israelites had made and burnt it in the fire, and ground it to a white powder. In this instance, the correct word powder is used, but firing gold does not, of course, produce powder, it simply produces molten gold. So what was this magical white powder? Is there a way of using heat to transform metallic gold into a white powder which is ingestible and beneficial? Indeed there is, and it is here that the foremost alchemical principle of the master craftsman was applied. To make gold, you must take gold. Gold is the most noble of metals, and gold was always representative of truth. Through the regular use of Anunnaki star fire, the gold of the gods, the recipients were moved into realms of heightened awareness and consciousness because of its inherent melatonin and serotonin. This was the realm of advanced enlightenment, the plane of Sharon, and the star fire gold was deemed to be the ultimate route to the light. Hence, the heavy, mundane person, lead, could be elevated to a heightened state of awareness, perceived as gold. This was the root of all alchemical lore thereafter. The showbread, or, as the Egyptians called it, tzfefood, was the traditional entitlement of the Israelite and Egyptian messiahs, for the early pharaohs were themselves fully consecrated priest-kings of the Grail bloodline, having descended to Nimrod in the Canaanite succession. In ancient Egypt, this tzfefood was always depicted as a conical cake. According to the records, this metallic bread was used to feed the light body, as against the physical body, and the light body was deemed to be the consciousness. As far back as 2200 BC, the pharaohs were using this supplement to enhance their pituitary and pineal activity, thereby to heighten their perception, awareness and intuition, but only the metallurgical adepts of the mystery schools, the master craftsmen of the Dragon Court, knew the secret of its manufacture.
In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the oldest complete book in the world, the pharaoh in search of the ultimate food of enlightenment asks, at every stage of his journey, the single overriding question, "What is it?" a question which in the Hebrew language, as explained in the Antiquities of the Jews, was asked with a single word, manna. When the Ark of the Covenant was completed, Moses' brother Aaron was said to have placed an omer of manna into the ark. This sacred manna was commonly associated with a mystical form of bread, the showbread, or, as it was called in Tubal-Cain's Mesopotamia, the shemanah. At this point, we come to a particularly important definition of the shemanah, for according to the master craftsman this conically shaped, or shem-shaped, food was made of what the Sumerians called highward firestone. In the New Testament book of the Revelation it is said, "To him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the hidden manna, and will give him a white stone." Before we look at the precise nature of the white stone of the shemanah, the bread made from the powder of alchemical gold, Let us firstly consider the famous statue of priest King Melchizedek at Chartres Cathedral in France. The statue portrays Melchizedek with a cup containing a stone in representation of the bread and wine which he apparently offered to Abraham, according to Genesis. The wine, as we know, was emblematic of the sacred star fire, just as communion wine represents the messianic blood today. But the true importance of the imagery is that the bread stone is held within the cup, thereby signifying that star fire was replaced by its substitute nourishment at the very time of Melchizedek and Abraham. This substitute was made from Sheminah, the white powder of gold, the highward firestone. The object of the substitute was very straightforward. Instead of feeding the recipient with a direct hormonal supplement, the powder had its effect on the endocrinal system, particularly the pineal gland, thereby causing the recipient to manufacture his own super high levels of hormones such as melatonin. In the famous Middle Ages Grail romance of Parzival, by Wolfram von Eschenbach, it is said of the Temple Knights of Grail Castle: "They live by virtue of a stone most pure. If you do not know its name, now learn, it is called lapis exilis. By the power of the stone the phoenix is burned to ashes, but the ashes speedily restore it to life. The phoenix thus molts and thereupon gives out a bright light, so that it is as beautiful as before." Many have wondered about the name lapis exilis because it appears to be a play on words, combining two elements. Firstly, it is lapis excalis, meaning stone from the heavens, and, secondly, it is lapis elixir, the philosopher's stone by which base elements are transformed to higher states of being. Either way, or both, it relates directly to the highward firestone, the Sheminah of the exotic star fire substitute. The key to the Parzival allegory lies in the description that the phoenix is burned to ashes, but from those very ashes comes the great enlightenment. So, what exactly is a phoenix? It is a mythical bird, we might answer. But we would be quite wrong. The word phoenix is far older than the Benya bird mythology, and it is in fact ancient Greco-Phoenician. Phoenix means crimson or red gold. Even today, within the confines of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the ancient Mass of the Phoenix is performed as a symbolic star-fire ritual. It is pertinent to note that Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, was an officer of this order, as a consequence of which, much of his novel is a coded representation of the secret knowledge. The two emblems of this ninth-degree ceremony are, the upright triangle of gold and light, representing spirit, and the downturned triangle of blood and water, representing matter. Interlocked, one upon the other, they form the familiar seal of Solomon, which contains the formula that is known as the gem of alchemy.
An old Alexandrian alchemical text makes particular mention of the weight of the philosopher's stone, which it calls the stone of paradise. It states that, when placed in the scales, the stone cannot weigh its quantity of gold, but when it is transposed to dust, even a feather will tip the scales against it. In terms of a mathematical formula, this relationship is written as 0 equals +1 plus -1. This appears to be a very straightforward sum at first glance, because +1 plus -1 does indeed equal 0. But when applied to physical matter it is actually an impossibility because it relies upon using a positive and an equivalent negative to produce nothing. The moment one has a positive piece of something, it is not possible to add an equivalent negative of that something to produce nothing. At best, one could move the positive something out of immediate sight, but it would still exist, and it would therefore not be nothing. The only way to turn something into nothing, as far as the material field is concerned, is to translate the something into another dimension so that it physically disappears from the mundane environment. If that process is achieved, then the proof of achievement would lie in the fact that its weight also disappears. What, then, is it that can outweigh itself but can also underweigh itself and become nothing? What, then, is it that can be gold, but can be fired and transposed to dust? It is the phoenix, the red gold that will fire to ashes but will then be restored to enlightenment. It is the golden calf that Moses burns to a powder. It is the Highward Firestone of the Sheminah. And we know from the Sumerian records that this was not made of stone at all, but of shining metal. In the alchemical tradition, the philosopher's stone is said to be that which translates base elements into gold. This is deemed to be the case in both the metallurgical sense and in the spiritual sense of higher enlightenment. In the physical sense, however, we must return to the oldest of all alchemical rules of the earliest mystery school. To make gold, you must take gold. Hence, it is determined that there are two distinctly separate forms of physical gold. The straightforward metal as we know it, and a much higher state of gold, that is, gold in a different dimension of perceived matter, and this is the white powder of gold, the hidden manna whose secret manufacture was known only by the master craftsman. So, what precisely is the Highward or high-spin state which converts gold, and platinum group metals, into a sweet-tasting, impalpable white powder? A normal atom has around it a screening potential, a positive screening produced by the nucleus. The majority of electrons going round the nucleus are within this screening potential, except for the very outer electrons. However, the nucleus goes to the Highward or high-spin state when the positive screening potential expands to bring all of the electrons under the control of the nucleus. Electrons normally travel around the nucleus in pairs, a spin-forward electron and a spin-reverse electron. But when these come under the influence of a high-spin nucleus, all of the spin-forward electrons become correlated with the spin-reverse electrons. When perfectly correlated, the electrons turn to pure white light, and it is quite impossible for the individual atoms in the high-spin substance to link together. Hence they cannot reform as metal, and the whole remains simply an impalpable white powder. The truly unusual thing about this white powder is that, through various applied processes, its weight will rise and fall to hundreds of % above its optimum weight, down to less than absolutely nothing. Moreover, its optimum weight is actually 56% of the metal weight from which it was transmuted. So, where does the other 44% go? It becomes nothing but pure light, and translates to another dimension beyond the physical world. This conforms precisely with the ancient Alexandrian text, that the Paradise Stone, when placed in the scales, cannot weigh its quantity of gold, but when transposed to dust, even a feather will tip the scales against it. Some of you may recall the Nexus publication of a lecture given by David Hudson of ORMS LLC, Arizona, in 1996, see Nexus 305-306. In this talk, David explained how he came upon the white powder production by pure chance when running laboratory tests on soil and ore samples. During the course of his extensive research, he discovered that not only is the powder of the Highward Firestone capable of raising human consciousness, but it is also a monatomic superconductor with no gravitational attraction. As a point of warning here, I should add that this particular powder of gold has absolutely no connection with the substances currently marketed under the labels of Ethereum gold, Isis gold, and Manitow gold. Whatever their advertising material might suggest, none of these products contain chemically measurable gold in the Highward state. One of the great researchers into gravity from the 1960s period has been the Russian physicist Sakharov, and the mathematics for Sakharov's theory, based on gravity as a zero point, were published by Hal Puthoff of the Institute of Advanced Studies in 1989, Physical Review A, Volume 39, Number 5, March 1, 1989. With regard to the monatomic white powder, Puthoff has made the point that because gravity determines space-time, then the powder is capable of bending space-time. It is exotic matter, he explained, with a gravitational attraction of less than zero. To put things into perspective, it is important to recognize that just about everything we now know about the life and civilizations of the distant BC years has been learned since the late 1800s. Prior to that, the Old Testament was one of very few documents of record. But the Old Testament was never intended to be an accurate reporting of history, it was actually a book of scripture designed to underpin a growing religious movement. To some extent, just like the scriptures of other religions, the Hebrew writings were based on mythological tradition, but, since the inherent stories were never found until recently in any other documented form.
The Old Testament has been treated for countless centuries as if it were an absolute, factual truth. And so the mythology became designated as history by our governing and educational establishments, and it has been taught as such in our schools and churches for the longest time. Now we have a vast amount of original literature enabling us to be far better informed, for a great number of ancient documents have been unearthed, many predating the original writing of Genesis by up to 2,000 years. One would expect such discoveries to be welcomed with enthusiasm. But this has not been the case. Instead, they have posed severe problems and are regarded not as beneficial revelations but as threats. What do they threaten? They threaten to undermine the one-time mythology that has been erroneously dubbed as history. How does the establishment cope with this threat? It clings on tightly to the contrived history, and declares that the first-hand documents of history are mythological. Between the 1850s and the 1930s, records which had been hidden for countless lifetimes beneath the windswept desert sands suddenly appeared, bearing the names of such well-known characters as Abraham, Esau, Israel, Eber, Nahor, Terah and many others from the Bible. These were written during the lifetimes of these men by people who were associated with them, whereas the books of the Old Testament were compiled over 1,000 years later. But, one by one, these documents have been classified as mythology. Why? Because they tell a very different story to that which we are taught from the Bible. By the 1880s, the governing establishments of Christendom were dreading the very word archaeologist. And so, archaeological digs were brought under strict control, and their funding and undertakings had to be approved by newly designated authorities. One of these, the Egypt Exploration Fund, was established in Britain in 1891, and on the very first page of its memorandum and articles of association it is stated that the fund's objective is to promote excavation work for the purpose of elucidating or illustrating the Old Testament narrative. In short, this meant that if something was found which could be used to support the scriptural teaching, then we, the public, would be informed. Anything which did not support the church interpretation of the Bible was not destined to see the light in the public domain. Now we are going to take a look at one of the monumental finds from the era, a discovery about which very little is known to people at large. In fact, it is probably the most important biblical discovery ever made, and it has stunning implications far beyond the discovery itself, for this is the ultimate story of the phoenix and the firestone. Within the book of Exodus, a significant biblical mountain is named. It sits in the extensive range of the Sinai Peninsula, the upturned triangular landmass which lies above the Red Sea between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. In the Old Testament, the mountain is firstly called Mount Horeb, then it is called Mount Sinai, and is subsequently called Horeb again as the story progresses. The story, of course, is that of Moses and the Israelite exodus from Egypt. This was the mountain upon which, according to Exodus, Moses saw the burning bush, the mountain where he talked with Jehovah, and the place where he received the 10 Commandments and the tables of testimony. Something that we should recognize at this stage is that at the time of Moses, roughly 1350 BC, there was no mountain called Mount Sinai. There was no mountain by that name even in the days of Jesus, nor even for another 300 years. It should also be said that the Old Testament, which is familiar to us today, is a translation from a Hebrew text compiled only 1,000 years ago, and it is therefore a few centuries younger even than the canonical New Testament. The mountain now generally known as Mount Sinai sits in the south of the peninsula, quite near to the bottom point of the upturned triangle. It was given its name in the 4th century AD by a mission of Greek Christian monks, 1,700 years after the time of Moses. It is now sometimes called Gebel Musa, or Mount of Moses, and a small Christian retreat, St. Catherine's Monastery, still exists there. But, was this the Sinai mountain which the Bible calls Mount Horeb? Well, it transpires that it was not. The book of Exodus goes into some detail to explain the route taken by Moses and the Israelites from the Nile Delta land of Goshen, down across Sinai, across the wilderness regions of Shur and Paran, to the land of Midian, which is to the north of present-day Jordan. From this route it becomes very easy to identify the location of Mount Horeb. It sits a good deal north of Gebel Musa. The word Horeb simply means desert, and the great desert mountain which soars to over 2,600 feet within a high stone plateau above the plain of Paran is today called Sarabit, or, to be more precise, Sarabat el-Kadim, the prominence of the Kadim. In the late 1890s, the British Egyptologist Sir William Flinders Petrie, a professor at the University College, London, applied to the Egypt Exploration Fund to take an expedition into Sinai. By January 1904, he and his team were in Sinai, and in March of that year they took their expedition to the heights of Mount Sarabit. In the following year, Petrie published the detailed results of his findings, but added to his report the fact that this information would not be made available officially to the Egypt Exploration Fund subscribers. They would receive only maps and a general outline. Furthermore, Petrie explained that even though he had taken previously funded teams into Egypt, from the time of that Sinai expedition his sponsorship by the fund had been terminated. Why? Had he perhaps broken the binding rule of the articles by divulging something which was contrary to Bible teaching? He certainly had. In fact, Petrie had discovered the great secret of the sacred mountain of Moses, a secret which not only made sense of the Exodus portrayals, but which, in so doing, blew the lid totally from their common scriptural interpretation. What the Bible does not make clear is that Sinai was not a foreign land to the Egyptians. It was actually regarded as a part of Egypt and came under pharaonic control.
So Moses and the Israelites had not left Egypt once they were east of the Nile Delta. They were still in Egypt, having the whole Sinai Peninsula to cross before they entered the Palestinian land of Canaan. During the time of Moses, Sinai came under the control of two Egyptian officials, the royal chancellor and the royal messenger. This was the era of Egypt's 18th dynasty, the dynasty of the Tuthmosis and Amenhotep pharaohs, along with Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. The royal messenger of those times was Nebi, an official who was also the mayor and troop commander of Zaru in the Nile Delta region of Goshen, where the Israelites had lived before the Exodus. The position of royal chancellor was hereditary in the Hyksos family of Panahasis, and Panahazi of this family was the official governor of Sinai. We know him better from the Bible as Phinehas. He became one of the first priests of the new Mosaic structure, but previously he had been the chief priest at Pharaoh Akhenaten's temple at Amarna. Before we get back to Sir William Flinders Petrie, and to understand the root significance of his discovery, it is worth making a necessary distinction between the Israelites and the Hebrews of the Mosaic era. At that time they were not one and the same, as Bible teaching seems to indicate. The Hebrews were the family and descendants of Abraham, and their place of residence was, in the main, Canaan, or Palestine. The Israelites, on the other hand, were the family and descendants of one of Abraham's grandsons, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. It was Jacob's family alone who had moved into Egypt, and it was their descendants who eventually returned with Moses, to be reunited, after countless generations, with their fellow Hebrews. The difference between the strains was, of course, that the Israelites had long been subjected to the laws and religions of Egypt and they knew very little about the customs of their cousins in Canaan. Through more than 400 years they had been in an environment with a whole pantheon of gods, and although they had developed a one-God concept within their own fraternity, that God was not the Jehovah of the Canaanite Hebrews. The Israelites' God was a faceless entity whom they called, quite simply, the Lord. In the Israelite language he was called Adon. This is one of the reasons why the names Lord and Jehovah were always separately identified in early texts, although they were brought under the wrap of the single God in later times to suit the emergent Jewish and Christian faiths. To the Egyptians, the name of this Lord, Adon, was quite similar. They called him Aten. From this derived the name of Pharaoh Akhenaten, meaning servant of Aten. So, when Moses and the Israelites made their exodus into Sinai, they arrived not as worshippers of Jehovah but of Aten. and it was for this very reason that they were given a whole new set of laws and ordinances to bring them into line with the Hebrew culture of their prospective new homeland. When Moses and the Israelites left the Nile Delta, their obvious route to Canaan, where they were eventually headed, would have been directly across the wilderness of northern Sinai. So, why did they push southward into the difficult high country to spend some time at the Horeb mountain of Sarabit? This was a question that had long puzzled Petrie and his team. So, what precisely did they find high on the Bible's holy mountain? Well, to begin with, they found nothing very much. But on a wide plateau near the summit there were distinct signs of ancient habitation, and some pillars and standing stones could be seen protruding above the ground rubble. This rubble had been deposited, little by little, by wind and landslides over some 3,000 years. But when it was finally moved away, the truth of the Bible story emerged. There is no other such monument which makes us regret that it is not in better preservation. The whole of it was buried, and no one had any knowledge of it until we cleared the site. What they found was an enormous temple complex. Set within an enclosure wall was an outer temple, built over an expanse of 230 feet, approximately 70 meters. This extended outwards from an inner temple cut within a great cave in the mountainside. From the various cartouches, carvings and inscriptions it emerged that the temple had been in use from as far back as the time of Pharaoh Sneferu, who reigned about 2600 BC and whose immediate successors are reckoned to have built the pyramids of Giza. The above-ground part of the temple was constructed from sandstone quarried from the mountain and it comprised a series of adjoined halls, shrines, courts, cubicles and chambers. Of these, the key features unearthed were the main sanctuary, the Shrine of Kings, the Portico Court, and the Hall of the goddess Hathor, to whom the whole complex was dedicated. All around were pillars and stelae denoting the Egyptian kings through the ages, and certain pharaohs such as Thutmose III, founder of the Rosicrucian movement in Egypt, were depicted many times on standing stones and wall reliefs. The adjoining cave of Hathor was carved into the natural rock, with flat inner walls that had been carefully smoothed. In the center, from about 1820 BC, stood a large upright pillar of Pharaoh Amenemhet III, the son-in-law of Esau. Also portrayed were his senior chamberlain and his seal-bearer. Deep within the cave Petrie found a limestone stela of Pharaoh Ramesses I, a slab upon which Ramesses, who is traditionally reckoned by Egyptologists to have been an opposer of the Aten cult, surprisingly described himself as the ruler of all that Aten embraces. Also found was an Amarna statue head of Akhenaten's mother, Queen Tiye of Egypt, with her cartouche set in the crown. In the courts and halls of the outer temple there were numerous stone-carved rectangular tanks and circular basins, along with a variety of curiously shaped bench tables with recessed fronts and split-level surfaces.
There were also round tables, trays and saucers together with alabaster vases and containers, many of which were shaped like lotus flowers. In addition, the rooms housed a good collection of glazed plaques, cartouches, scarabs and sacred ornaments designed with spirals, diagonal squares and basketwork. There were magical wands of an unidentified hard material, and in the portico were two conical stones of about 6 inches and 9 inches, respectively, in height. The explorers were baffled enough by these finds, but they were further confounded by the discovery of a metallurgist's crucible. Ever since, Egyptologists have argued as to why crucibles would have been necessary in a temple, while at the same time debating a mysterious substance, called MFKZT, which seemed to be related to the crucible and the conical stones and which had dozens of mentions in wall and stele inscriptions. Some have suggested that MFKZT might have been copper, many have preferred the idea of turquoise, and others have supposed it was perhaps malachite. But these are all unsubstantiated guesses, and there were no traces of any of these materials at the site. Sinai is noted for its turquoise mines, but if turquoise mining had been a primary function of the temple masters over so many centuries, then one would expect to find turquoise stones in abundance within the tombs of Egypt. But such is not the case. Hardly any have been found. Another cause of wonderment has been the innumerable inscribed references to bread, along with the prominent hieroglyph for light found in the Shrine of the Kings. The discovery which caused the most bewilderment, however, was the unearthing of something which was identified as the enigmatic MFKZT, to which the bread symbolism seemed to be related. Laying some inches deep in a storeroom was a considerable supply of the finest, pure white, unadulterated powder. At the time, some suggested that the powder could be a remnant of copper smelting, but, as was quickly pointed out, smelting does not produce white powder, it leaves a dense black slag. Moreover, there was no supply of copper ore within miles of the temple, and the old smelting works were in any event apparent in the distant valleys. Others guessed that the powder was ash from the burning of plants to produce alkali, but there was no trace whatever of any plant residue. For want of any other explanation, it was determined that the white powder and the conical stones were probably associated with some form of sacrificial rite, but again it was pointed out that this was an Egyptian temple and animal sacrifice was not an Egyptian practice. Moreover, there were no remnants whatever of bones or any other foreign matter within the MFKZT, which appeared for all the world like a hoard of sacred talcum powder. Some of the mysterious powder was taken back to Britain for analysis and examination, but no results were ever published. The rest, open to the elements after 3,000 years, was left to become a victim of the desert winds. What has become apparent, however, is that this powder was seemingly identical to the ancient Mesopotamian firestone or shemen-na, the substance that was made into bread cakes and used to feed the light bodies of the Babylonian kings and the pharaohs of Egypt. This, of course, explains the temple inscriptions denoting the importance of bread and light, and this white powder, the shemen-na, was identified with the sacred manna that Aaron placed in the Ark of the Covenant. In Egypt, the cakes made from this powder were called sfa food, while the Israelites called them show bread. The Book of Exodus tells us that the master craftsman who made the original showbread for Moses in Sinai was Bezaleel, the son of Uri ben-Hur. But Bezaleel was not a baker, he was a noted goldsmith, the very man who made the golden accoutrements for the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. This conforms precisely with the function of the priestly master craftsmen in Mesopotamia. They were the great Vulcans and metallurgists of Tubal-Cain, who manufactured the valuable shemen-na from pure gold. As for the crucible, the conical stones and the great array of tanks, tables and equipment which made the Sinai temple appear more like a gigantic laboratory than a church, it emerges that this is precisely what it was. What Petrie had actually found was the alchemical workshop of Akhenaten and of the 18 dynasties of pharaohs before him, a temple laboratory where the furnace would have roared and smoked in the production of the sacred firestone of the high-spin shemen-na. Quite suddenly, the words of Exodus begin to make sense as we read them again with a wholly new insight. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. In Exodus we read that Moses took the golden calf which the Israelites had made, and then burnt it in the fire and ground it to a white powder. This is precisely the process of a shemen-na furnace, and it is evident that the Egyptian priests of the goddess Hathor had been working their fire for countless generations before the priests of Aden became involved in the time of Moses. It was in fact Pharaoh Thutmose III who had reorganized the ancient mystery schools of Tot and founded the royal school of the master craftsmen at Karnak. They were called the Great White Brotherhood because of their preoccupation with a mysterious white powder. A branch of this fraternity became especially concerned with medicines and healing, and they became known as the Egyptian Therapeutate. In much later times, the Therapeutate extended its activities into Palestine, especially into the Judah settlement of Qumran where they flourished as the Essenes. But what was so special about the goddess Hathor? Why was she the chosen deity of the Sinai priests? Hathor was a paramount nursing goddess, and as the daughter of Ra she was said to have given birth to the sun. She was the originally defined Queen of the West and Mistress of the Netherworld, to where she was said to carry those who knew the right spells.
But, in Jasher, which predates the Exodus writings, these laws and ordinances are not conveyed to Moses by Jehovah. In fact, Jehovah is not mentioned at all. The new laws, says the book of Jasher, were communicated to Moses and the Israelites by Jethro, high priest of Midian and lord of the mountain. In effect, Jethro was the overall governor of the Sinai temple. In Hebrew, the title Lord, or Lofty One, of the mountain was translated as El Shaddai, and this is particularly significant for that was precisely the name related to Moses when he asked the Lord to reveal his identity. The Lord said, I am that I am. I am he that Abraham called El Shaddai. I am that I am eventually became transposed to the name Jehovah, but, as related in Jasher, and as confirmed in Exodus when correctly read, this Lord was not a deiform God at all. He was Jethro the El Shaddai, the great Vulcan and master craftsman of the Hathor temple. Apart from the fact that we are taught about certain aspects of the Bible text, I think it is fair to say that not too many of us actually study the books ourselves. As a result of this, our perceived images are generally those conjured by picture books and films. Hollywood, of course, has done us proud with its portrayals of Moses on the mountain and God blasting the words of the Ten Commandments onto two great, barely portable, granite slabs. In Exodus, however, there is no such depiction, and the commandments are said to have been written down by Moses himself, at the dictation of the Lord, after he had broken the first tablets that he was given. As for the other part of the Sinai package, the tables of testimony, these are stated in the teachings of the Kabbalah and the Midrash to have been held within a sacred gemstone which Moses placed in the palm of his hand. This was the same divine stone of wisdom said to have been inherited by King Solomon. In the earlier texts of Egypt it was called the Tablet of Hermes, which embodied the wisdom of Tot. According to the records of the ancient dragon court of Egypt, founded by Queen Sobekneferu in 1785 BC, an early guardian of the table was Kem, the high priest of Mendes. The word Kem, or Kame, means blackness, and from this root word derived the word alchemy, the science of extracting light from the blackness. To us, Kem is perhaps better known as the biblical Ham, the grandfather of Nimrod, whose family was cursed by the Hebrews because his historical tradition was in conflict with the emergent Jehovah-based culture. Readers of Gothic novels and books about sorcery will, of course, recognize the name Kem of Mendes. He is often symbolized by a goat, which was precisely the emblem of Ham in ancient Egypt. The only difference is that in latter-day Christian lore the goat is meant to be symbolic of the devil. What we now discover, however, is that by following the story of Kem of Mendes we are led directly to the Sinai temple and to the white powder of gold. Mendes was a major city of the Egyptian delta, and Kem was the temple's designated archon of the 10th age of Capricorn. It was in this Capricorn regard that his symbol was a goat, generally depicted by an inverted pentagram. This five-pointed star has two uppermost points, which are the horns of the goat of Mendes. The two downward-sloping side points represent the ears, and the single base point is the chin and beard. When a pentagram is seen in this inverted position, it is regarded as a male emblem, but the pentagram star is, of course, a female device, a Venus symbol, and is usually shown with the single point uppermost. In the pentagram's male position, Kem is personally identified by an emerald jewel set centrally at the meeting of the horns. When turned about, the pentagram achieves its female status with the uppermost single point becoming the head of the goddess. The side points are now arms, while the twin points, once the horns, are now at the base, being the legs of the goddess, with the emerald jewel of Venus established in the vulval position. Sometimes the inverted pentagram of Kem is shown with flames rising from the sacred jewel between the horns. These flames are traditionally referred to as astral light. But when reversed into the Venus position, the uterine flames are identified as star fire, the lunar essence of the goddess. From the earliest times, whether representing astral light or star fire, the pentagram was indicative of enlightenment. It was associated with the pre-Jewish Sabbath, a ritualistic period of reflection and experience outside of general toil. For this reason, Kim of Mendes was called the sabbatical goat, from which derived today's use of the word sabbatical in academic circles. In view of this age-old tradition, it is hardly surprising that the pentagram and sabbatical goat became associated with heterodox Christians, like the Cathars of Languedoc, from medieval times. In contrast, the Orthodox Christian Church endeavored to overhaul the old wisdom of the mystery schools by creating a hybrid religion based upon salvation from the unknown, a salvation that was only attained through people's subjugation to the authority of the bishops. As an outcome, the spiritually based doctrines of the Gnostic movement, which sought to discover the unknown, were declared blasphemous by the Inquisition. While the pentagram and the goat were denounced as symbols of black magic and witchcraft. From those times, even to the present day in some circles, personal attainment and learning which does not conform to the bishop's opinions has been considered heretical. And individually acquired wisdom became so feared that the goat of Mendes has been decried as the epitome of the devil himself. This is manifest in a wealth of trashy propagandist novels, by Dennis Wheatley and others, wherein crucifixes and holy water abound as the weapons used against the so-called emissary of Satan. Ham, or Chem, is given in the Old Testament as a son of Noah, but in the oldest records he is correctly identified, along with Japhet, as being a son of the great Vulcan and goldsmith Tubal-Cain, who is better known to historians as King Mescal of Dug, the hero of a good land.
In the early lore of Palestine, Chem was synonymous with a certain Azazel of Capricorn who, according to the Book of Enoch, made known to men all the metals, and the art of working them, and the use of antimony. Antimony is the black element otherwise known as stibbium. This is an essential ingredient of the preparatory alchemical process when producing the philosopher's stone. In the ancient Arab world, antimony was called coal, from which derives the word coal, meaning that which is black. The related word alcohol stems from the Arabic alcohol, the highly refined philosophical mercury prepared from spirits of wine rectified over antimony. Azazel of Capricorn actually appears in the Bible, but not in the authorized English language translation. In the Vulgate Book of Leviticus there is an early reference to the custom of atonement, and it states that Aaron shall cast lots upon 2 goats, one for the Lord, and the other for Azazel. That which fell to the lot of the Lord was to be sacrificed as a sin offering, and the other was to be sent into the wilderness as an atonement. The more familiar English translation is somewhat confusing, for the name Azazel has been supplanted by the word scapegoat. The reason for the substitution was simply that the original sequence made it quite clear that Hebrew offerings were made both to Jehovah and to Chem Azazel, while the Book of Enoch, which was excluded from the Old Testament, drew readers' attention to the direct link between Azazel and Hermetic alchemy. In the tradition of the Rosicrucian mystery schools, the writings of Chem, the Tabula Smaragdina Hermetis, were recorded as the most ancient monument of the Chaldeans concerning the philosopher's stone. Being associated with the wisdom of Tot, or Hermes, they were defined as Hermetic teachings, and they were directly linked to the fire alchemy of pyramid construction. The very name Hermes derives from the word Herma, which means a pile of stones, and the Great Pyramid was called the Sanctuary of Tot. The word pyr, from which derive pyro, fire and pyramid, actually means fire, and the pyramids were so called because they were fire-begotten. This leads us to one of the great unanswered questions: how did they build the pyramids? Were the thousands of massive blocks raised to great heights with such accuracy by hundreds of thousands of slaves using nothing but ropes and ramps over an undefined period of time, as is the common speculation? Certainly not. To construct an inclined plane to the top of the Great Pyramid at a gradient of 110 would have required a ramp 4,800 feet, approximately 1,463 meters, long, with a volume 3 times greater than that of the pyramid itself. As we saw earlier, the powder of the Hayward firestone is a monatomic superconductor. It is exotic matter with a gravitational attraction of less than 0. Recent experiments with this amazing white powder of gold have proven that, under certain conditions, the substance can weigh less than nothing and can be made to disappear into an unknown dimension. The most interesting quality of the powder, however, is that it rides upon the Earth's magnetic field, so that when it is in a zero-gravity state it is capable of transposing its own weightlessness to its host, thereby facilitating levitational powers. This host might be a laboratory pan, a container, or a table, or it could just as easily be an enormous block of stone. The age-old tradition relates that in the secret repository of the king's chamber within the Great Pyramid the builders had placed instruments of iron, and arms which rust not, and glass which might be bended and yet not broken, and strange spells. But what did the first explorers find, having tunneled their way into the sealed chamber? The only furniture was a lidless, hollowed stone coffer, and it contained not a body but a layer of a mysterious powdery substance. This has been superficially determined to be grains of feldspar and mica, which are both minerals of the aluminium silicate group. During the course of the recent white powder research, aluminium and silica were two of the constituent elements revealed by conventional analysis of a granular sample that was known to be a 100% platinum group compound. Standard laboratory testing is done by striking a sample with a DC arc for 15 seconds at a sun surface heat of 5,500 degrees centigrade. However, with the white powder, a continuation of the burn time way beyond the normal testing procedure revealed the noble platinum metals of which the substance truly consisted. It is because of the limitations placed on the conventional testing sequence that 5% by dry weight of our brain tissue is said to be carbon, whereas more rigorous analysis reveals it as the platinum metals iridium and rhodium in the high spin state. The king's chamber was, in fact, contrived as a superconductor, capable of transporting the pharaoh into another dimension of space-time. And it was here that the pharaoh's rite of passage was administered in accordance with the Book of the Dead. The key to this rite of passage is defined by a single conical inscription near the entrance to the chamber. This hieroglyphic symbol, the only verifiable hieroglyph on the whole of the Giza Plateau, and the very same as appeared many times at the Sinai Mountain Temple, reads, quite simply, bread. In the context of this talk, we have stepped beyond the bounds of the Bible to witness the alchemical and scientific process which facilitated the genesis of the Grail kings. This line of succession from Cain, through Egypt to King David and onward to Jesus, was purpose-bred to be the earthly purveyors of the light. They were the true sons of the gods, who were fed firstly on Anunnaki star fire from about 3800 BC and, subsequently, on high-spin metal supplements from about 2000 BC. In short, they were bred to be leaders of humankind, and they were both mentally and physically maintained in the highward state. The ultimate dimension of the missing 44%, the dimension of the orbit of light, or the plane of Charon. Only during the past 150 years or so, and more specifically during the past 80 years, have the great storehouses of Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Syrian and Canaanite record been unearthed from beneath the desert sands. First-hand documentary evidence from before Bible times has now emerged on stone, clay, parchment and papyrus, and these many tens of thousands of documents bear witness to a far more exciting history than we were ever told. Had these records been available throughout the generations, the concept of a particular race enjoying a single divine revelation would never have arisen, and the exclusivity of Jehovah,
which has blinded us for the longest time, setting us in warlike fashion against those of other faiths who follow their own traditions, would never have taken such an arrogant hold. Gradually, as new discoveries are made, it is evident that we are now emerging from the darkness of our preconceived but unfounded notions. Even so, our centuries of church-led indoctrination make it very difficult to discard the restrictive dogma of inbred third-hand tradition in favor of a greater enlightenment from those who were there at the time. The truly inspiring prospect is that the learning curve has still not ended. Just as a single glacier is but a continuation of age-old activity, so too are the ancient wisdoms that now fall to us one by one, with each new facet of learning ready to be stacked upon the former knowledge. Fortunately, the dawn of consciousness is already behind us and, although some will choose to look backwards beyond its veil, many will step with vigor into the new millennium to witness a bright new sunrise, a revelation of unbounded possibility and a restoration of our true universal inheritance. We have the secrets of immortality at our fingertips, the cures for all kinds of things, left to us and discovered in tombs, ancient ruins, hidden archaeology, statues. These gods were none other than the Anunnaki we have mentioned earlier.
So I hope you like this video. Please share our videos on Facebook with your friends. Don't forget to do like, subscribe and comments on our video. Thanks for watching.